G'day YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. I just heard the 11 o'clock news and I decided what's the point in being silent? 4th of June 2020, General Mattis, a bloke the Pentagon used to call Mad Dog Mattis. He used to be a part of the Trump administration, but Trumpy fired him because he wasn't radical enough. Mad Dog Mattis wasn't radical enough for Trumpy. He made the 11 o'clock news on the radio in Australia because he has declared that Trumpy, President Trump, quote, is a clear and present threat to the Constitution of the United States of America. I want you to think about that in terms of the following. There are 300, maybe 320, let's call it 330 million Americans. There are something like 330 million firearms privately owned among the citizenry in America. That's why I like to characterize the place as being the excited status of Norte armed Americano. Ever since the Revolutionary War with England, really, the US has had a bit of an overcompensated inferiority complex regarding its ability to arm itself against possible threat of foreign invasion and domination. And certainly since the US Civil War, a large segment of the US firearm industry has been militarily focused. During the First World War, Europe financed the construction of a massive armaments industry in the US, and pretty much by the time the loans had been repaid because of the massive profits that the Europeans were paying on munitions of war, the only way to expand demand was for the US itself to get involved in the war, and that is what happened. So Americans have a long-standing love affair with things that go bang and project pellets across the landscape. Death machines. Technologies for disseminating the seeds of death across the landscape. 330 million guns among 330 million people. And here's the funny thing. Only 25% of all American citizens possess a firearm. 80 million of them have at least one gun. But there are enough guns for one for everyone. Which means that perhaps 15 to 20% have at least 5 guns. Which means you could have 50 or 60 million people out there who are looking at a collection, a personal collection of firearm death machines, pellet projectors, and they've got half a dozen to choose from. That's datum point 1. Okay? 80 million civilian-owned firearms in the US. Probably 60 million people who have half a dozen to choose from. Now here's datum point 2. We're going to start a long way back. Have you ever heard of Lord Baden-Powell? He was an Englishman, and he noticed at a place called Mafeking, which I think was kind of during the Boer War, he noticed that your average British suburban city recruit was pretty hopeless in the bush. They were having rings run around them by the South African Boers, the descendants of Dutchmen who'd gone there 300 years ago, 400 years now. So this Lord Baden-Powell, he started what he called the British Boy Scout movement, the Imperial British Boy Scout movement. And the whole idea was to take ordinary suburban boys and teach them how to camp in the forest, teach them how to live in the woods, teach them how not to be a bunch of absolutely incompetent, tender-footed city pricks, idiots, hicks, whatever you want to call them. Anyway, so Baden-Powell started that in 1909 or something. And the international scouting movement moved across the world. After the First World War, it was completely international. I think in Germany they were called the Pfadfinders Bund, because Pfad means path, so they were the Pathfinders Brotherhood. But yeah, it was kind of Boy Scouts all around the world. And a fella called Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, and he didn't like the idea of there being any organisations that were not totally devoted to the furtherance of the prosperity of his form of government. So he set up the Hitlerjugend, which was the Hitler Youth, and the Hitler Youth was not apparently able to tolerate any competition from the Pfadfinders Bund. So the Hitler Youth was officially promoted, funded, stimulated. The Pfadfinders Bund was officially persecuted out of existence. Basically, the Pfadfinders Bund, the German Boy Scouts, all became Hitlerjugend. And then Germany invaded the USSR. And somebody said to Stalin, look at how fanatical they are. It's because all of the Germans who were in the army, they were all in the Hitlerjugend. So Hitler's copy of the British Boy Scouting movement led Stalin to set up the Komsololskaya, which was unisex, because such was the Soviet Union at the time. So the Komsololskaya, it was just like the Hitler Youth, which was just like the Boy Scouts. And then in the 1950s, there was a bloke called Senator Tail Gunner Joe McCarthy in the US. See, you didn't think I was going to be able to bring this segue around, but here it goes. Tail Gunner Joe McCarthy, he looked at the Komsololskaya and he saw how fanatical the teenage Soviets were when they came out of it. I mean, you know, look at Melania Trump. She was the final fruition of the Komsololskaya. The blonde bombshell exported to the West as the last dying gasp of the NKVD. Set out with instructions to try and latch on to the son of a rich capitalist and see how far up the pyramid of power she could ride him. How else do you think Putin's got such a fucking super strong hold on Trumpy? Because it was Putin's old NKVD mates who financed Trumpy after he married Melania. Kind of interesting, that. But anyway, Tail Gunner Joe McCarthy, he looked at how fanatical the Komsololskaya was and what great little motivated do-or-die recruits it provided to the USSR. And he said in the 1950s, oh, we've got this youth motivation gap. And just as the Hitlerjugend, every day in school they had to pledge allegiance to the Führer. The Komsololskaya, every day in school they had to pledge allegiance to Stalin. Tail Gunner Joe McCarthy, in his anti-communist fanaticism, he managed to pass a law through Congress requiring that every American school child, from the first day of kindergarten to the last day of high school, has to start their day by standing beside their desk, staring at an American flag, perhaps with a picture of the president on the wall beside it. They put their hand on their heart and they swear an oath of allegiance, and I'm quoting here, to the flag of the United States of America and to the Constitution for which it stands. They swear to defend the flag and the Constitution, quote, against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Every one of them. All 330 million of them who've been alive since the 1950s. Everyone from the boomers onwards, because the boomers started in 1946. You couldn't be a boomer unless you were conceived after Victory in Europe Day, when your parents, who'd been holding off starting a family for so long, got involved in the drunken orgy on the streets of New York, Paris, London, Rome, all of the liberated cities of the world, all the allied cities of the world. Everybody indulged on VE Day. And then they did it again, those of them who were warring against the Japanese, on VP Day. So your boomers are from 1946 to 1956, 10 years. Okay, those boomers, they were going to school under tail gunner Joe McCarthy's new little American mini Nuremberg ceremonies every day in every school classroom right across the land. They are all absolutely thoroughly indoctrinated to protect the flag and the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It goes stronger in the US than the Hitlerjugend's oath of loyalty to the Führer, to the point where the SS used to consider that their honour was their loyalty. They would obey any order which came down the chain of command, regardless of how stupid it appeared, because they had absolute ultimate faith in der Führerprinzip. Right. Well, the Americans don't actually have absolute faith in der Führerprinzip. That's where Trumpy's made a bit of a mistake. He has now behaved so badly, so incredibly badly. He has, through his malfeasance, negligence, mismanagement, and misgovernment, he has created a situation in which twice as many Americans have died from a novel zoonotic viral pandemic, pneumonia, which he had 3 months warning of. He's mismanaged that to the point where his administration has killed twice as many US citizens through mismanagement as Johnson and Nixon did combined in 10 years of being bogged in Vietnam. There was only 116,000 Americans killed in the First World War. He's almost equaled Kaiser Wilhelm II's tally of dead Americans. And as far as I know, 3 weeks ago, the best predictions, according to Johns Hopkins University, was that if Trumpy succeeded in reopening the economy because he didn't want to have it locked down because oil was about to go into minus $37 a barrel price range, if he succeeded in reopening the American economy, getting rid of all of the social lockdowns, 1 million dead citizens by the 4th of July, because he's already killed 100,000 of them and only 1% of 300 million have actually had the virus. If the virus runs wild through the population, 60% will have the virus. Think about that. The death rate's really only going to stop when the people become too sick to go out and interact with each other. And now confronted with a situation where 4 police officers, in the course of making one arrest of one suspected perpetrator accused of having passed a counterfeit $20 note. Now, he was never questioned. The matter was never investigated. Nobody knows whether he thought it was a real $20 note. Nobody knows whether there was any more fake $20 notes in his wallet. Although, believe me, since the 1830s, it has been well known in English-speaking civilization that if you are passing counterfeit notes or coins, never appear in public with more than one at a time. If you have more than one counterfeit note, that's it. You will be arrested and charged and probably convicted of passing counterfeits. If you've only got one and you've got a couple of genuine ones, you can say, well, I don't know, I've got it in change, and you will more than likely be let go at that point. But this George Floyd, he was never questioned, he was never interrogated, he never made a statement. They grabbed him on the street, he didn't resist, the cameras showed, the security cameras everywhere, he didn't resist, they just handcuffed him and put him on the ground, and three of them put their body weight onto his chest and abdomen. So his diaphragm couldn't push his guts down out of the way to get his lungs to inflate. They were holding his rib cage flat. And Derek Chauvin, can you get your mind around the irony of that? Derek Chauvin. I wonder how closely or distantly he was related to a bloke called Pierre Chauvin, the Frenchman who said, quote, my country, right or wrong. The bloke who said he didn't care what the evidence was. He didn't care what the moral, ethical, spiritual particulars of the situation were. La belle France was going to war against Prussia, and therefore, my country, right or wrong, he would go out there and kill Prussians because the tricolor said that he had to do it. Okay, that's how you get into the idea that anybody who thinks that all men are always all right and always entitled to suppress all women, they are called chauvinists, not because Pierre Chauvin was necessarily into the suppression of women, but they are called male chauvinists, whereas Chauvin was a French chauvinist. And anybody who's a national chauvinist who's not from France is just called a nationalist. They don't say, oh, you're an Australian national chauvinist. No, you're an Australian nationalist. You're an American nationalist. But basically, you're doing national chauvinism. And who is it who orchestrated the 8-minute 53-second public execution of a man on suspicion of passing a counterfeit note? Derek Chauvin. Derek Chauvin. So what you see over there is everybody who is defending the police, defending the status quo ante, defending the right of the authority to suppress the right, they are the chauvinists. They are arguing in favour of Chauvin. And everybody else is just a freedom fighter. And Mattis has said Trumpy is a clear and present threat and danger to the US Constitution. Yeah. Well, there's this thing called Zoom. You get it on your smartphone. Allows you to do conference calls. There are these things called apps, applications. Pretty sure there's a Ouija board app out there. Ouija board, you know, where you contact the spirits of the dead. How long is it going to be before one of the 80 million Americans who is in possession of a Second Amendment embodied firearm fantasy takes their Ouija board app and their Zoom access and they have a conference call with the departed shade of Lee Harvey Oswald and or John Wilkes Booth? People who have a proven historical track record in the field of dealing with what they saw as an existential threat to the US Constitution, or whatever the fuck was in their heads when they did it. They know how to shoot presidents. 80 million Americans are in possession of the embodiment of a Second Amendment fetish. Maybe 50 million Americans are in possession of 5 or more, 6 or more Second Amendment fetishes. How long before some of those who were raised on the legend of Audie Murphy, those who covet public recognition for their bravery in order to bolster their own self-esteem so that they can feel good enough about themselves to consider that they are not past it, that they are contributing members to the society, that they are worthy of a public venerational parade up the main street of their hometown with everybody clapping and cheering? How many of them are considering the idea that if the pentagonal hemorrhoids represented by General Mad Dog Mattis, consider that Trumpy is an existential threat to the US Constitution. How long before they figure out that whoever it is who takes out their Second Amendment fetish and applies it to the current situation, they're going to get a Congressional Medal of Honor? Now, they might not get it the day after, but when the tumult and the shouting dies down, anybody who rids the excited status of Uncle Spam from an existential threat, a domestic enemy threatening the Constitution, inaugurated into the White House after a Russian-influenced election, that individual is going to get a Congressional Medal of Honor. In the fullness of the time, it'll probably be posthumous. I'm sorry about that. It would be better if the US could come to its senses and resolve their shit a different way. But this is my prediction. One of the 80 million Americans who owns a gun is going to go gunning for Trumpy. And it's going to come from a long way up inside his own security apparatus. And if one is to judge by the way that the CIA dealt with Egypt and India and Pakistan, it's going to be one of Trumpy's own Secret Service, Schutzstaffel, Polizei guards. That's who kills the presidents all over the world. It's their own fucking guards, because they have the guns, they have the deeply indoctrinated patriotism, and they have the opportunity and the access. Unless one of his family does it, like what happened to the Nepalese king, yeah, Trumpy's up shit creek. Mattis has just called the pentagonal hemorrhoids out on him. He's identified him and flagged him as a threat to the US Constitution. Instead of immediately dealing with those 4 murderous fucking idiot cops, Trumpy has tried to play this for votes among his dwindling supporter base. And he's caused the US to become the only nation in the history of the world who, when confronted with a novel, global, viral pandemic pneumonia, instead of locking down, he's got the whole country out shouting in each other's faces while breathing tear gas. Does anybody, any respiratory physician, virologist, epidemiologist, does anybody have any clear idea what it does to your chances of surviving coronavirus if you've been breathing tear gas? I've never heard of anybody having any fucking idea about that. And I read New Scientist. I listen to ABC Radio National. You know, like, I pay attention to this. By training, I was a registered general nurse. I haven't been registered since 1998, because what's the point in paying your registration fee when you haven't worked for 12 years? It's a fucking affectation. I know what I know. I don't need a piece of paper saying I'm allowed to put on a Band-Aid in a first aid situation. I'll do whatever I fucking want to, up to the level of my training. I probably won't initiate surgery unless we're dealing with major trauma and I need to remove foreign bodies. But if I really had to, you know, I've been known to cut fish hooks out of people and sew them up afterwards. That was easier because I had local anaesthetic available. But yeah, they taught us in 1980 or 81 in virology, epidemiology at Repatriation General Hospital Concord in Sydney. They taught us that what the world had to be really, really, really afeard of was a novel viral droplet contagious pneumonia which did not have an initially high death rate. If it kills everybody really fast, it'll be like Marburg virus. Every time the bats in Congo tried to get rid of the bat eaters, it would kill that village, and then the whole village was dead and the virus would die out because it couldn't go anywhere. Eventually, Ebola mutated to become less deadly. It only kills 60%, and you get a fortnight being symptom-free but contagious. But Ebola, it's only contagious with actual bodily fluids. Shit, piss, spit, urine, blood. Right at the moment, there are now 13 cases of Ebola in the Congo. There are 170 cases of COVID-19 in the Congo. 4 or maybe 6 years ago, I read in New Scientist that somebody who was worried that terrorists might start trying to mutate viruses to make them more deadly had succeeded in getting a coronavirus, like a SARS-1 coronavirus, not SARS-2, but an old SARS virus, to swap RNA with Ebola in the lab. So the two viruses are capable of swapping RNA. All it's going to take for this to really do the wildfire viral thing is for a patient to simultaneously be infected with SARS-CoV-2 and Ebola. If you've got those two viruses inside a single cell and they're both replicating at once, they unwrap their protein coat and they dump their RNA out there, and then they put it all back together, and when they've got a complete string, they build another protein coat, and then eventually there's enough of them that it kills the cell with their metabolic demands. We could yet see coronavirus that has half the people asymptomatic for 2 weeks, and then 60% of everybody who's got it bleeds to death out their eye holes on the 18th day. And what they taught us 40 years ago is the reason the medical fraternity is so fucking terrified is because in 1919, everybody had to travel around the world in steamships. Ross and Keith Smith were the first people to fly from England to Australia, and Alcock and Brown were the first people to fly from America to Ireland in 1919. But there were no airliners. If you got a boat coming in from a place where the underground telegraph cable had warned you that there was a plague or a pandemic pneumonia afoot, you could just put that boat into quarantine. Australia didn't actually catch the Kansas Spanish 1918-1919 flu until February, March 1919. And I grew up on stories of it. My mother's mother had one of her school friends die of it. My father was younger. He was 10 years old. In 1919, both his parents were bedridden with the Spanish flu. The Glen Innes Hospital was so overfull they had tents covering the lawns to contain the people who needed hospital care. They didn't know what a virus was. The next door neighbours brought a pot of soup over to my grandparents' house. My father had to light the fire to heat the soup to feed to his parents to stop them from dying from the Spanish flu, and there was no firewood. He finished up barefoot, scrabbling for driftwood along the banks of the Rocky Ponds Creek, aka the Park Creek in Glen Innes, from their house on West Avenue. And he used driftwood to light the fire to heat the soup to feed to his parents to stop him from dying. Left a lasting impression. He was 73 when he died, and he had cut, split and stacked undercover. He had 5 years worth of firewood ready to go. Me, as you can see, I live in the forest. So give us this day our daily firewood. My greatest problem is trying to get rid of it before it rolls around a bushfire season and it all tries to kill me. But yeah, I've always known about the flu at the end of the First World War. I've also read Neville Shute's autobiography called Slide Rule. His father was the postmaster in Ireland, so Neville Shute spent his school holidays when he was 16 as a stretcher bearer on the streets of Dublin during the 1916 rebellion. His brother was killed in France in the First World War, and Neville Shute couldn't get in to officer training because he had a terrible stammer, and his parents put him through misery trying to cure his stammer. Eventually, he enlisted as a private, and his stammer was so bad they sent him to defend the Isle of Wight in late 1918 to defend it against the Germans. But the mincing machine was going through people so constantly that he was still likely to be sent to the front and chewed up in the advance in about a fortnight's time when the First World War ended. He then stayed in the army, and he spent all of 1919 on what they called a funereal firing party. And there was him and 6 or 8 other blokes. And what they did every day of the week was travel by train around England, southern England, around London, and provide a firing party at the funeral of a military officer who had died from the 1919 flu. He might have gone to 5 funerals in a day. You know, rest on your arms reversed, honour guard, fire, honour guard, fire, honour guard, fire. And they'd fire 3 rounds, pack away their rifle, march back to the railway station, get on the train, chug, 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 toof, 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 woo, woo, off to the next funeral. For a year, he did nothing. 52 weeks, but bury dead flu victim officers in army, in England. Army officers, Navy officers, Air Force officers, Flying Corps officers. The scale of the death that the flu pandemic inflicted on the world, when 60% of the people who were alive on the world caught the flu, and 1% of those who caught it died. At the moment, this current viral pandemic of COVID-19, it has a death rate of anywhere from 1 to 7%, depending on how you count it. At the moment, everybody who's looking at the optimistic side says you take the number of dead today and divide them into the number of people who are confirmed to have the disease today, and you might be around 3%. But half of the people who are infected show no symptoms, so that pulls it down to 1.5%. And when you've got really good track and trace and really good medical care, it comes down to nearly 1%. And the pessimists are saying, yeah, but 18% of everybody who's confirmed to have it needs to be hospitalised. Their average age is 54. 2/3 of them are men. 90% of the dead are 60 or over. 97% of the dead are either already unhealthy with a pre-existing medical condition, or they're fat. They're obese. In Japan, very few people are dying of COVID-19 because the only fat Japanese is a sumo wrestler. In America, 45% of the population is clinically obese. And guess what? Here in Australia, 60% of the population is clinically obese. I know. I go shopping in the supermarket. I see people with what are called back boobs. It's titties growing on their collarbones, and they might be wearing a bra or not, depends on their genital sex and their identification. But you can see their back boobs wobbling as they walk up the aisle, pushing 8 loaves of white bread with 30 pounds of mince and 4 cartons of fucking Coca-Cola. And as they walk, if they're wearing shorts, they have rolls of fat across the back of their knees. If COVID gets loose in Australia, we're going to have a higher death rate than Brazil, because in Brazil, the only thing causing them to be fat is their shithouse diet, and what moderates it is the poverty. But here in Australia, we have a better social security net. So yeah, in the middle of a viral pandemic like that, Tron will dump the prissy dunce of all Uncle Spam. He's chosen to exacerbate and initiate a potential complete balkanisation and race riot by offering to put the US military on the streets of any US city where he deems that the governor is not sufficiently aggressive in trying to dominate the protesters. I am but an Australian. I don't profess to have a deep understumbling of the American cornstarch tuition. But I'm pretty certain in my understumbling that ever since the US Civil War, there has been multiple governmental acts, laws, requirements, restrictions, which prevent the deployment of US forces on US soil against US citizens until Prissy done so blah blah. The token black fella that they let go into the White House to make it look all right, because that's fucking all he was. If you don't understand that, you're not paying attention. Prissy done so blah blah went in there and he took the Patriot Act, which was enacted after mysteriously 2 aeroplanes hit 3 buildings in New York. And 3 buildings fell down after only 2 aeroplanes hit only 2 of them. And the Patriot Act was already drafted, written, ready to dump on the table as a big pile of paperwork, and it was inaugurated in the shock and the horror of 2 buildings falling down. Sorry, 3 buildings falling down when 2 aeroplanes hit 2 of them, and then something happened at the Pentagon where there was a 5-metre hole punched in an office window, and then that segment of the office building fell down, and there were no trenches in the lawn left by the engines of the aeroplane that did not fly across the lawn, and the aeroplane that did not go in through the window. Remarkably mysterious, and I have no actual hard information on who done it, what for, and why, but applying the Machiavellian principle of who benefited, the US military-industrial complex wanted a forever war. And the US Supreme Court therefore stopped the counting when Al Gore won by 2,600 votes, maybe 6,000 votes. I don't know, I forget the figures. But ever since 1990, the US has been a completely out of control, anarchistic gangster state. It's been a fucking free for all. Point being, George Walker Bush, and the only difference between him and Hitler is that Hitler was elected. George Walker Bush brought in the Patriot Act, and the Patriot Act pretty much allowed the US pentagonal hemorrhoids to do whatever they wanted, wherever they wanted, anywhere in the world, except on US soil and except against US citizens. And President Barack blah blah, he was talked into letting them have permission to do drone strikes in Yemen against US citizens. And somehow that was widened in order to permit the Pentagon to operate and deploy the US military against US citizens on US soil. Think about that. Barack blah blah enabled the Pentagon to deploy on US soil against US citizens for the first time since the Civil War. President Trump's throwing snow. He's saying he's going back to 1805 to the Insurrection Act. That's horseshit. He only needs to go back to blah blah. All he's got to do is declare his designated enemies to be terrorists, and yeah, he can do drone strikes in fucking Manhattan if he wants to. That is what the US population has stood still for. And when you think of the level of obedience and indoctrination that is prevalent among the people who are in the US military and how fucking young they are, they're probably going to do whatever they're told to do, whether it's nuke Iran, nuke China, nuke Russia, or fucking drone strike Manhattan. They'll do it because they want to get their paycheck at the end of the week to pay off their credit card. They don't want to be unemployed. They'll do whatever it takes to keep the money coming in, just like a concentration camp guard at Auschwitz being asked to shoot Jews. There is no fucking difference. I'm not calling for Trumpy to be shot. I think he's going to be shot. I expect him to be shot. I will be surprised if he's not shot. Don't know who's going to do it. Any one of the 50 to 80 million Americans who've got more than one gun. But at some point there, yeah, probably it'll be a really studious, hyper-patriotic member of the Presidential Secret Service, or maybe just one of the snipers who are employed to sit on the rooftops and get ready to shoot anybody in the surrounding crowds who looks as if they might be suspicious. I can't see America spontaneously, suddenly coming to its senses and deciding to live as pacifists and vegetarians, doing what they can to minimise their impact on the environment while trying to ameliorate the effects of the anthropogenic global warmings that we have been bequeathed by the last 250 years of fossil-fueled industrial global harvest everything ism. And we've nearly destroyed the fucking biosphere of the earth. Anything that the rest of the ecology does to reduce human numbers and stop industrial economic growth in its tracks, it's what Charlie Darwin told us to expect. It's evolution, mate, you know? The rest of the biosphere is not going to stand by while humanity destroys the last 1.5% of the biomass and the biodiversity that's left on the earth in order to grow our economy, make the fucking stock market share price index rise so that the old, fat, sick male farts, my age cohort, are going to be able to retire in the lap of luxury on their superannuation plan funded by their own grandchildren working 60 to 80 hours a week, 3 or 5 casual jobs at minimum wages to make sure that the multinationals are sufficiently profitable as to provide a dividend to the shareholders so that the insurance companies who've sold them the superannuation plan can afford to pay them to retire in the manner to which they want to remain accustomed. Planet Earth doesn't have those resources, not for those numbers. We're going to be thinned out. We're going to become a fucking rare species. And believe you me, when the excited status disappears up its own cloaca after all of the fucking COVID-19 that's been spread in the last 8 days of people shouting in each other's faces in the streets while they're supposed to be socially isolating, in a country where 100,000, 110,000 or so have already died, yeah. When you consider that the US economy was the largest source of demand for China, all that means is that Chinese factories are going to go broke because they've got nowhere to sell their shit to. All of the Asian clothing factories are going broke because they've got nowhere to sell their shit to. All of the clothing shops in the Western world, they're going broke because they order their stuff a year in advance and they've got fucking shelves full of stuff that nobody's bought for the past 2 months, 3 months. So they're selling $300 worth of clothes for $50 to get it out of their shelves so they can make room for the new lot of stuff coming from the warehouse. And of course, if you've just bought $300 worth of stuff for $50, are you going to buy anything next week? You've got enough. Yeah. Yeah, the international global vile age is on its way down. And for General Mad Dog Mattis to be publicly declaring that Trumpy is an existential threat to the US Constitution, that's it, mate. They've just declared open season on Trumpy and he's too fucking stupid to notice it. The Pentagon has declared open season on Trottle Dump. That prick gets around with a fucking target invisibly engraved on all 4 sides of his head. The cleverest thing he can do is go to church and lick a fucking lamppost and hope he dies of COVID-19 on a respirator, because that's the only way he's ever going to get any favourable treatment in any history of the world that ever gets written, if any does. Because we're going a long way down. We are going such a long way down that we're not going to be able to exacerbate global warming ever again, probably within less than 10 years. All fossil fueled industrialism will be over by then. And if you haven't got the fossil fueled industrialism, you can't fucking dig and process the silicon to make your solar panels. You can't make the concrete to build the towers, to put your windmills on. There is never going to be any bright, shiny, onward, upward, sunlit fields of endeavour for the economy to advance into. Elon Musk will never die on Mars. He will never land on Mars and alive and then die there. If he tries really, really hard, he may be able to get there and go splat when he bounces off the fucking lithosphere breaking, as a method of arresting his progress. But anyway, that's some of the rants that I've been holding in. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao. Such is life. Have a good one. Stay safe. And try to get a laugh out of the fact that all of this shit is obvious. None of it is difficult to stumble. It's as fucking plain as the nose on your face.